On the line, we have Geoff Rowe talking to us from... Where are you talking to us from?
My home office at the moment. I'm doing some work at home today.
And obviously we should mention you're from Leicester.
Well, yes, not originally. I came here to study at De Montfort University, but I've lived here for a long time, that's for sure.
I think you're one of those people whose names in Leicester people recognise.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. If you hang around anywhere long enough, you get a reputation which is hopefully good, I suppose. But yes, I think you're right.
So obviously the reason why we're here is to sort of talk about the history, I suppose, of the Leicester Comedy Festival. The reason why I'm saying history is you stepped down last year, didn't you?
Yeah, it was actually a couple of years ago. I think it was the 30th anniversary, whenever that was. That was my last festival. And I decided 3 decades was long enough. I always had in the back of my mind that I could do something else other than the comedy festival. And after 30 years, I thought if I didn't step down, then I would never find out whether I could do anything else. Turns out I'm not entirely sure I can do anything else, but that was the plan. So yes, I stepped down, and I'm still sort of. I don't have an official involvement with the festival, but they still very kindly credit me as the founder, and I do a few bits and pieces for them, but nowhere near as much as I used to. And the current team are doing an amazing job, I think. With the trustees of the charity that runs the festival, in developing it and moving it into a new existence, really. So yeah, I'm no longer have an official involvement.
This takes us all back to 1993, which is when you came up with the idea for the Leicester Comedy Festival. It was part of your degree, wasn't it? It was part of, I presume, your sort of dissertation kind of end of year project kind of thing.
It wasn't actually my dissertation. My dissertation was terrible because I spent most of my final year being obsessed by the festival. And you win 5 bonus points because most people say that the whole thing started in 94, but obviously even that first festival, which was quite a good size, given it was a student project, we started putting it together in 93, you're right. So that's when we got the venues on board, that's when we got comedians booked, patrons on board. They were very important in those early years. And we started to put the shape of the festival together in the autumn of 93. And then we did it in February 94 was the first one. Yeah, that was the kind of timescale of that first festival.
This was the days before the internet. This was the days of Windows 95, Windows 98, pre-social media. How hard was it to get off the ground?
Yes, you're right. There was no internet and no email, really. So we spent a lot of time faxing people because that was the way in which it worked. We wrote letters to people and we used the telephone. Makes me sound like I'm about 105 years old, but that's the way it was in those days. And we got an awful lot of support very quickly from local venues. So the old Phoenix Arts Centre on Newark Street, which is now the Sue Townsend Theatre, and the Y Theatre, the two directors of those venues were incredibly supportive and helpful. The council kind of got behind it, the local newspaper and radio station, BBC radio station got behind it. And there was quite a lot of energy, I suppose, and excitement. Stand-up comedy was, in terms of sort of contemporary stand-up comedy, alternative comedy, whatever you want to call it, was very, very, very exciting in those days. And there was a real surge in terms of comedians getting well known. I mean, it sounds a bit weird talking about that now because stand-ups are now, huge and on TV and all of that. But those people that kind of came on board the consortium, as it was called, in that early year were incredibly supportive. And also we decided very early on to get 2 patrons, because nobody had a clue who we were within the sort of comedy industry. None of us as students had any experience of promoting or producing comedy shows. We didn't really know any comedians or agents, but it felt like a very exciting thing to do. But because we didn't have any credibility, we decided that if we got 2 patrons, then when the faxes came out of the fax machine, there would be a little logo saying Leicester Comedy Festival, and then patrons, whoever they were, and that would be a sort of talking point. It would make people go, oh, that's quite interesting. So we managed to get Norman Wisdom to be a patron of the festival. I wrote to him, care of his agent. There was a directory in the university library of performers and their agents, and so you could look up the performer and you'd find out the address of their agent. So I wrote to Norman, and he wrote back to me a personal letter and said, thank you very much for inviting me, I'd love to be a patron, which was amazing. And then the second person that I wrote to was a comedian called Tony Slattery, who was mega famous in 1993. It's hard really to explain now how huge he was. Tony was on TV all the time, particularly in a programme called Whose Line Is It Anyway, that was on Channel 4 on a Friday night. And I wrote to Tony, and unbelievably again, he actually rang my student house and said, could he speak to me? And we had a chat, and he said, I'm really fascinated by your idea. Thank you for asking me to be a patron. I'd love to be a patron of the festival. So in terms of how difficult it was, we sort of put in place some things that made it easier for us. But it's a good question, because Leicester wasn't really on the comedy map in the UK. Cities like Liverpool, Glasgow, London, obviously Brighton, these are places that had a sort of comedy tradition, and Leicester had a tradition in terms of comedy writers. Joe Orton, Sue Townsend and others lived here and were from Leicester. But in terms of stand-up and live performers, Leicester didn't really have a huge tradition. So it was neither difficult nor easy really putting it together, but certainly locally there was a lot of support for it.
And of course, we should mention, there's a video at the minute circulating on Facebook of you looking at the first ever, I suppose it's leaflet of the Leicester Comedy Festival, and one just looks at it and sees Harry Hill, who obviously everyone will have heard of at some level or degree, and the charge is £2.50.
Yeah, I remember that gig very clearly. It was at the old Student Union of De Montfort University, and yes, Harry Hill performed. Tickets were £2.50. He was supported by an unknown comedian at the time who performed a character called Sir Bernard Chumley, and that was a guy called Matt Lucas, who's kind of gone on to do quite well in terms of his career. Not entirely down to that gig, I hasten to add. Harry did a show, John Shuttleworth, a guy called Nick Park, who people may have heard of, but he created Wallace and Gromit. He came and did a sort of Q&A for us as part of the festival. There were other comedians in it, but the first festival was really diverse in terms of its programme. So we had films, we worked with a youth theatre to put on a play, we did a tour of comedy shows to old people's homes, there were visual art exhibitions. Even in that first year, we wanted to try and make it as diverse and inclusive as possible, and I think that ethos of the festival continues to this day, and I'm really proud of that. Our mantra used to be, and it may well still be, that everybody laughs at something, and our job as festival organisers were to put as many of those things as possible into a festival as we could, to try and attract a diverse audience. And as I say, that kind of ethos continues to this day, which is great.
You mentioned about patrons, you mentioned about Tony. Obviously, I need to make everybody aware at this point, he has since passed away, and almost very recently, actually, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, he was a patron in the first year with Normal Wisdom. They were joined shortly afterwards by Sean Hughes and Sue Townsend. And Tony was a fairly active patron for, well, in excess of 30 years. He was due to come to the festival this year, and he came last year and did bits and pieces for us, but was hugely supportive. And as you say, he sadly passed away earlier this year. And I think the festival should recognise him and the contribution that he made over such a long time. I don't quite know what that's going to look like, but yeah, it's very sad that he's now gone, and he will be really missed because his contribution to the festival and to British comedy was enormous. He needs to be remembered.
Sort of like a tribute show, maybe. That kind of.
Yeah, perhaps. Haven't really thought it through in any great detail, but yes, I think the festival should do something to recognise the contribution that he made. If it wasn't for Tony Slattery, there wouldn't be a Leicester Comedy Festival, and I'm really keen to say that as many times as possible because he was a very warm, loving, kind, generous man.
I mean, when you look at the people who've obviously been at the festival, is there anyone that you didn't manage to get that you would have liked to have had?
Almost consistently every year for 30 years, I invited Stephen Fry to come and do something. I mean, Stephen doesn't really do stand-up or indeed many live performances, but I used to write to his secretary, then his PA, and then would email and stuff in later years. But Stephen was somebody that I would have loved to have got to the festival. And who knows, maybe he will come in the future. But he's one person that springs to mind as somebody I would have loved to have been as part of the festival.
I mean, that surprises me, actually. I mean, he's very, big in terms of philosophy and comedy.
Well, feel free to contact him and see if you can persuade him.
This question is going to be an interesting one for you, I think, Geoff. You'll see where I'm coming from in terms of where I'm going with this. Obviously, you mentioned at the start of the interview that it was obviously a completely different time and very diverse, very cultural. And now we have this kind of, and I dare say it, cancel culture, where people who may get offended by certain jokes feel the need to sort of obviously put it on Twitter, put it on Facebook and social media. What are your views on like that in terms of comedy? Because can't someone just take a joke? It's a joke.
Yeah, I get asked this quite a lot. I think it is absolutely right that we should tell jokes about absolutely anything and everything. I think, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing that is off limits, and I'd go a bit further than that and say we absolutely must tell jokes about everything and anything. I think the alternative is that somebody decides, and there are places in this world, there are countries in this world where people like the government, for example, decide what you can and can't tell jokes about. And I don't want to live in a place like that. I think the most important thing is the intent behind the joke. If the intent behind the joke is to be harmful, to annoy people, to upset people, then I don't really want anything to do with that. And I hope the festival, certainly whilst I was there, didn't have anything to do with that type of comedy. But I think comedy is a really good way of coping with the really grim and bleak things in life and in the world. And it's a very useful coping mechanism for dealing with stuff that's, terrible and often awful. It can help to relieve the tension. And so I think really good comedians can do that brilliantly. And so because I think therefore nothing is off limits, really. And I think I am fortunate in that I know a lot of comedians, and I kind of think I have a good idea of what their intent is. You can probably think of comedians yourself who might do jokes in order to harm people, mentally upset people, split communities, put communities up against each other, all of that. I'm not interested in that as a thing, but what I do like is when people use comedy to deal with difficult subjects, and that might be uncomfortable for some people at the time, but as I say, it helps to burst the bubble. It helps to release the tension around some issues, and I think that's really, really important.
One of the people who springs to mind who definitely has done the Leicester Comedy Festival is Jimmy Carr, who obviously has gone on to be this massive worldwide sensation in America as well. But some of his jokes are quite hitting the mark almost.
Yes, I think so. I mean, he's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. And that's fine. I mean, it's more than fine. It's great, I think. There's a line, isn't there? People often talk about crossing the line. And what I enjoy is when the line itself moves. So you might think that you can't tell jokes about cancer, for example. And I'm not necessarily talking about Jimmy Carr, but comedians can tell jokes about cancer and can do it in a way that's sensitive and appropriate to an audience. So, it's a complicated issue, and often people disagree with me. They say you can't tell certain jokes about stuff, but I think it's really important that we embrace the notion that you can and must tell jokes about absolutely anything, because as I said at the beginning, the alternative is that somebody has to decide. And I know, some people think I'm being flippant about it, but I'm not. If you don't have freedom of speech in terms of comedy, somebody will need to decide what you can't tell jokes about.
Well, obviously we need to talk about the pandemic, because the pandemic must have had a huge impact on what had already been a successful 25 or so years. Obviously technology then became a factor, because then people would have to have it at home and view it from home as well. TikTok and social media, do you see the change to more online watchable shows, or do you think that we're still okay in watching it in the pub or theatre or wherever?
Well, there's a massive boom at the moment in terms of live comedy. I think that's a bit of a hangover from COVID and the pandemic, when people couldn't go and see stuff, and I think comedy is benefiting massively from that. I mean, there's a whole thing about social media and TikTok and other platforms that I know nothing about, where people have developed their careers, developed and grown their fan base massively. But what I'm pleased to say is live comedy seems to be having a boom at the moment, and people are enjoying going out, sitting in either a tiny room or a massive room with lots of small numbers of people watching comedy. And it won't surprise you to hear, having run a live festival for 30 years, that is my preferred form of comedy. If comedians can also make some money and build their audience through other means, that's great. But live comedy is where it's at in terms of where I'm coming from.
A project that you are heavily involved in is this archive that you've managed to start up and look at the past 30 years history of the Leicester Comedy Festival. One news article came to mind when I was doing the research, which was the fact that someone found old archival photographs of I think it was Johnny Vegas.
Yeah, so I kept absolutely everything. So for 30 years I would collect all newspaper cuttings, magazine articles, printed materials, posters, brochures, loads of stuff. All of those physical items, a few years ago we donated to the archive at De Montfort University. And then what happened was we found thousands and thousands and thousands of digital images, which are basically on a hard drive, but they are in no particular order, or they're not catalogued in any way, shape or form, really. So last year, I think it was, I decided that these images needed to be looked at and archived and catalogued in a way that makes some sort of sense. So, for example, the files are named as the comedian and the year and the venue, so that they can be searched online more easily than at the moment. So there's a bunch of volunteers who meet once a month for a couple of hours and laboriously go through all of the images. Many of those images I kind of recognise or remember, but by going through them all, we discovered a load of images that if the volunteer group hadn't gone through them, they would have been lost forever. So pictures of, as you say, Johnny Vegas when he won the Leicester Comedian of the Year competition, Nicholas Parsons, we've got pictures of Dylan Moran at the festival, loads and loads. And we are still going through those, and we'll still go through them, I imagine, for years. It will take ages to go through them all, but I want to make sure that every photograph is seen, because as you're flicking through those images, you suddenly come across some gold. We found, for example, we mentioned Tony Slattery earlier on, we found a load of images of him backstage and on stage when he'd been at the festival before, and I'd not remembered that at all. So it's amazing that we're able to do that, and there is an archive day during the festival on the last Saturday where people can come if they're interested and have a look at some of the materials that we've collected, and we're still looking for volunteers to join the archive group to help us. So yeah, I mean, that's really exciting. I think it's probably one of the biggest collections of contemporary comedy material and memorabilia anywhere that exists, and I want to make sure that it's easy for people to search it and find stuff. I've spoken to loads of comedians and members of comedians' families after they've passed away, and it's quite a common thing that people collect stuff, and the question I have is, where is this stuff going to go? Because if we're not careful, it's going to be lost, and I don't want the festival archive to be lost. So it's a bit of a work in progress.
Is it just purely photos, or is there video or audio?
So at the moment, we're just going through the photos. We have loads of VHS videos when somebody was on any radio for the festival, you know, doing interviews and stuff. I used to rush home and sit and press play and record on my cassette recorder and record the interviews on your local radio, but also national radio. And so we have all of that. But at the moment, our focus is on the photographs. If we included video and audio content, that's going to take even longer to go through. But hopefully one day we'll get it all done. What's interesting about the archive is it's obviously an archive of Leicester Comedy Festival and comedy stuff, but it's also an archive of Leicester's live performance venues. There's loads of venues that we used in the early years that are no longer there. They've either been knocked down or turned into flats or something. So I think in some small way we've contributed to an archive of Leicester's entertainment scene over 3 decades, and I think that's really important. You know, it also touches on fashion, on media. You know, we've got copies of the Leicester Mercury, for example, from 1994 and 95, and so it helps to archive a whole host of things, not just the festival. It obviously focuses on the festival.
I always say this podcast is a bit like an archive in some respects, because you're speaking to people like now, and it's sort of like a little pocket almost, isn't it, in terms of history. Well, Geoff, obviously good luck with the archive. Is there anything else you'd like to plug? Anything that you've got coming up apart from the archive?
No, I don't think so. I think I think that's been great. My hope when I left was that the structure was in place, and the right sort of infrastructure is in place to enable it to last another 30 years, and if that happens, I'll be chuffed to bits.
Because actually, at the end of the day, we're a part of history now, aren't we? I suppose because of doing this interview, you know, in about 70 years, when it's the 100th, me and you are both going to be long gone by that point, and people might be listening back to this.
Who knows? They may well be, yes. I think these sorts of things are really useful. I think it's really important to document things, as you say, maybe not for now, but for in years to come. as I get older, it's more important, I think, than ever to try and preserve stuff and archive stuff so that they are there for the future.
Well, Geoff, it's been a pleasure interviewing you.
Thank you. It's been nice chatting to you too.
Thanks very much for your time.
No worries. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.